Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Conference for Research on Male Supremacism and the Conference on Right-Wing Studies, co-hosted by the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism and the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. We are going into our closing keynote. After the keynote, there will be a virtual reception where attendees of the conference can speak with other conference goers in a more informal session, and you have a separate link to a breakout room where those conversations will be happening. As always, please use either the Q&A function or the chat to send any messages that you would like to direct to the panelists to answer during the Q&A portion. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A and some discussion between our esteemed panelists during the course of the conversation today. I'm very glad to be here and with how well the whole conference has gone. My name is Alex DiBranco. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, and we've been really pleased to have you all with us this week. I'm going to introduce now our first speaker, who is also the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, Dr. Lawrence Rosenthal. He has studied the right in the United States and in Italy, and has taught at UC Berkeley in the Sociology and Italian Studies departments, and was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Naples. Rosenthal co-edited Steep, The Precipitous Rise of the Tea Party and the New Nationalism and the First World War, and is author of the forthcoming Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism, that will be released September 8th, 2020. So look out for that. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Foreign Policy, and many others. So Larry, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Alex. And let me be another voice complimenting you on putting this thing together, not only conceiving of it and you know, having the nerve to go ahead with it, but to do it under these extraordinary circumstances. I congratulate you. All right, what I want to talk about, let's start with the notion of the Second American Civil War. This is something that has emerged into, I don't know, things like the popular press in a way during the Trump years that is fairly unprecedented. But in previous years, one could encounter the discussion of a second civil war in a widespread way on the extreme right. So the idea of the Second American Civil War has a kind of Bible, and the Bible is a novel called The Turner Diaries, published in 1972, written by William Pierce, and it gave basically a formula, and that formula has existed almost as a kind of fantasy on the extreme right, the militia right, for many years. And the idea is that a single event will spark off the Civil War. In the Turner Diaries, that event was what was called the Cohen Act. And the Cohen Act was an extreme anti or gun control law. And the patriots rose up, and by the end of the Turner Diaries, the only people who continued to exist on Earth were white people, just to give you some idea. But in the right-wing discussion of the Second American Civil War. There are really two threads, two different kind of accounts of what it means and how it'll come about. One of them is, and I'm going to use the phrase today, the "don't tread on me patriots" version, who question the legitimacy of particular government actions like gun control as infringements on their liberty. And in fact, very often, this "don't tread on me patriot" version denies the legitimacy of government altogether. And they have a particular emphasis on guns and the place of guns in their lives and the fear of imminent government takeover or prohibition of guns. That's one thread. The other thread is the white nationalist thread, the idea that a single event would spark a racial conflict that would essentially be the equivalent of a new civil war. So we have these two threads. A kind of simple way of looking at the two threads is to say one is the kind of Timothy McVeigh thread, which is the "don't tread on me patriots" thread. And the other, you could say, is the Dylan Roof thread, which is the white nationalist thread. And each of those events, the idea of the perpetrator was, I'm going to do this grotesque act, and the patriots are going to rise up, and there will be something like a second civil war. Okay, let me move on to talk a little bit about the Tea Party. The Tea Party era lasted from the inauguration of Barack Obama as president in 2009 until 2016, when Donald Trump clinched the Republican nomination for president. But in the context of this Tea Party era, in a nonviolent and muted form, nothing as extreme as the Civil War characters, there were echoes of these two threads. These two threads existed throughout the Tea Party era in this much more muted fashion. And what's more, there was a transition between them. And the transition went from the "don't tread on me" version of anti-government resentment to white nationalism. The "don't tread on me" version became obvious early on in the Tea Party's opposition to Obamacare, which they argued was taking away their liberty, and government does not have the right to do that. I was very pleased yesterday that Isabel Kanan talked about popular constitutionalism in her talk, and what the Tea Party relied on was what legal scholars came to call popular originalism, which is to say a version of popular constitutionalism which takes as its legal philosophy the originalism that's associated with the Federalist Society, with Robert Bork in the 1980s, and Antonin Scalia in the 1990s and beyond. So you would get in arguments against Obamacare things like, show me where in the Constitution the government has the right to institute health insurance. When in 2010, the 63 Tea Party people were elected to Congress, to the House of Representatives, and the Republican Party took over the House from the Democrats, they began a policy of beginning every congressional term by a full reading of the Constitution. So extreme was their belief that they, in their populist or popular originalism, had the real story of what the American Constitution was. Okay, so you have, as I suggest, this kind of don't tread on me opposition to Obamacare and the like in the early Tea Party. Somewhere around 2015, which is coincident with the quote unquote refugee crisis in Europe, you have a transition, and the transition is around the issue of immigration. And what you get then is the Tea Party turning from its emphasis on things like Obamacare to questions of immigration. In my forthcoming book, I argue that the fundamental story of how Donald Trump won the 2016 election, won first the nomination and then the election, was that he migrated America's right-wing populists, which is what the constituency of the Tea Party was. He migrated them from the ideology of free market extremism a la the Koch brothers to America First anti-immigrant nationalism. So that transition occurs in the Tea Party era. In the Trump era, at the level of the far right, the extreme right, the militia right, and so forth, there has been a similar transition, but in the reverse direction. The far right in the Trump era has moved from white nationalism as the dominant force to extreme don't tread on me patriotism. And the two models, the two ideas, the two threads have different ideas or models of what insurrection and civil war look like. So I want to talk first about the white nationalist version of that. Let's see. I could prepare a talk, but I couldn't prepare my voice quite as well as I might have liked. All right. The white nationalist version of this right-wing extremism in the Trump era is most famously goes by the name the alt-right. Their idea of the Civil War, of the uprising, is based on the Nazi or the fascist model. If you may recall that shortly after, like 2 weeks after Trump's electoral victory, still November of 2016, Richard Spencer, the quote unquote head of the alt-right, met a bunch of his followers at a reception in a hotel in Washington, which, and one can find this on YouTube, involved a lot of Nazi salutes, hail victory, and Spencer would dip into German and Nazi sayings in the original. The development of the alt-right's version of uprising, or the coming, or how civil war was going to happen, emerged after the April 2017 quote-unquote Battle of Berkeley, in which the alt-right appeared and there were street scuffles and things of that nature. This was a watershed for the alt-right. Richard Spencer, after the Battle of Berkeley, was ecstatic. He believed that American politics had entered, to use his phrase, entered a new world. We have entered a world of political violence. I don't think anything is going to be the same. We are back in the 1930s. That's a quote from him. And what he meant by that was that the conditions in America, which had been about polarization left and right, had now turned to what he called fragmentation, and that Americans were going to be forced to choose between an extreme left and an extreme right. This goes beyond his earlier versions of white dispossession, which motivated the alt-right in the same way it has motivated all those other international movements which cite things like replacement theory. Again, another quote from Spencer: "White dispossession is so real, it's so obvious, it's just something one can't ignore, that a reaction had to occur, and it was only a question of when or how. It wasn't a question of whether." So when the street fighting happens in Berkeley, he transitions in his thinking and in the movement to, okay, it's time for street fighting. And what he talked about was that the two camps would see each other as existential foes and would fight for space on the ground and ideological space for, quote, who's going to control society and culture going forward. This new normal is going to be a politics of occupying space with violence at its core, and people will be forced to choose one or the other side. This was the mindset that drove the planning for Charlottesville, which was August of 2017. If you remember the name of the Charlottesville demonstrations, it was called the Unite the Right rally. The real goal was essentially a united right militia. And if you think of the nighttime marches with the tiki torches and blood and soil and Jews will not replace us and you will not replace us as chants, that prefigured the unified militia that the organizers were hoping would come out of that. The most significant fact about that is that it failed. And I won't go into why it was a failure. That will lead us far afield. but the think about how much less one hears of the alt-right now than one did 2 years ago. The model, if Spencer believed the model was appropriate, the Nazi or fascist model was appropriate for his movement, he fundamentally read the moment erroneously. It didn't work. So then there's a transition, this transition to the don't tread on me model. And the what has brought that to the fore is the COVID crisis. In particular, it is the reaction to lockdown and to the authority of experts, above all, perhaps Dr. Fauci. If you think about the first anti-lockdown marches, they were actually quite reminiscent of the early Tea Party. That is to say, there were a lot of, let's call them right-wing populists, who were objecting to to how being asked or being told to lock down was an infringement on their liberty. And in a way, what that indicated from at the level of the populists, of the right-wing populists, was a transition from, or a transformation of what was called in the Tea Party era popular originalism. What you had then in the COVID crisis was the emergence of populist epidemiology in a parallel fashion to what populist constitutionalism looked like. This movement against authority was joined by the extreme right in its incarnation, or in this thread of the "Don't Tread on Me" patriots. And they were actually very, and as I suggested earlier, the distinctions between these two threads are blurry. People migrate across, extremists on the far right migrate from one to the other. And what had happened on the extreme right was a serious dissatisfaction with the failure of the Nazi model, of the alt-right model. If you can recall back to the alt-right, they used to have a phrase to insult traditional conservatives, who they called cuckservatives, a combination of cuckold and conservatives. With the failure of Charlottesville and the Spencer model, with that, the far right began calling the alt-right the alt-cucks. What you get, how am I doing on time?
We're at 20 minutes, so.
Oh dear. Oh,
you wanna,
okay.
All right. We're not tight on time, so if you want to take another 5.
I will do that. I figured your appearance suggested time. All right. Well, what you get is the emergence of what goes by the name accelerationism, in which the far right is now dropping goals in favor of a generalized uprising, kind of essentialized revolutionaries, and the groups that have emerged from that are called things like the Boogaloo Bois. And this finally gets extremely complicated because of the ensuing demonstrations around George Floyd, the George Floyd protests. Among the agencies that the accelerationists most despise, and the don't tread on me extremists most despise, are the police. And here were demonstrations against the police, but there were demonstrations about Black people. Black Lives Matter. This, which we don't have time to go into, creates an extreme contradiction. The last thing I want to mention is the resonance of these issues with the Trump administration and the emerging Trump campaign. As far as populist epidemiology is concerned, it has this kind of both tragic and comical edge. You get Donald Trump suggesting that you could mainline Clorox. Recently, it's demon sperm, and the Republican Party has followed with almost in lockstep. Recently, GOP representatives met and called upon Liz Cheney, who votes with Trump 97% of the time, to resign from the leadership or be removed for supporting Dr. Fauci. All right. So the resonance of the populist epistemology in the Trump world is apparent. About the white nationalist world, Trump has taken whole hog Spencer's framing of extreme right versus, as he calls it sometimes, alt-left or Antifa. Antifa was Spencer's, symbiotic alternative. Spencer needed that, and Trump has picked it up. He talks about dominating the streets in a way that parallels Spencer's ideas of street fighting, and Antifa has been designated as a terror organization by the Trump government, the first domestic organization ever so designated. And they have picked up as well from the Don't Tread on Me, Boogaloo Bois elements in both the government and the campaign. You can remember Trump saying liberate various states, and in Michigan in particular, he tied that to the Second Amendment. The people who have showed up with as paramilitary in above all in Minneapolis, these people are essentially taken from the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has as its preparation what has gone on the southern border, which is talking about a state of emergency, and these elements have emerged in Trump's campaign. So he tries to tie Biden to the far left, the Antifa, and he is making a series of TV commercials which show that you are not safe in your houses because of the violence on the streets. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much for your remarks, and I look forward to following up on some of them in the Q&A later. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Terri Givens. She is the CEO and founder of the Center for Higher Education Leadership. She is the author and editor of many books and articles, including Legislating Equality, the Politics of Anti-Discrimination Policy in Europe, and Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. Her forthcoming book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, is scheduled for publication in February 2021. Givens has written and given talks on subjects including Trumpism, populism, and centering racism in scholarship on the radical right in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us today, we are really glad to have you. Please take it away.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, make sure I'm in the right spot. But I just wanna say hello to everybody. I was away for the last few days in the Sequoia National Park and actually saw some bears. So I haven't been available to be part of the conference so far, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I have a few slides. So I apologize if, go back to the original, there we go. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I haven't been around for most of the conference, so I apologize if there's overlap, but that's always a good thing in academia, I think, if we can find where we have overlap and similar interests. So in any case, I'm talking about politics and the era of populism more generally, but of course we're interested in what's going on today. But I really do want to talk about the context of where we are. And I know Larry just talked to a certain extent about that, and but I do believe that it's important to give some context, and first to give some context about myself. My first book was Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. So I started studying the radical right in Europe back in the mid-1990s when I was a graduate student at UCLA, spent time in France and Germany, as well as Denmark and Austria. It was a really interesting time to be studying the radical right because, of course, we had the rise of Jörg Haider in Austria. There was the Republikaner and DVU in Germany, and of course the far right in France, the National Front. And so then also the Danish People's Party came onto the scene. So I was really, as a political scientist, focusing on the politics of it and putting it in the context of the broader competition between the mainstream parties and the radical right. So you can see my main argument there. Here, I'll go to full screen. But, at the time, part of the reason I shifted away from just focusing on the radical right, everybody was telling me, oh, the radical right is just a flash in the pan, they're gonna go away. So, by the time your book is published, it won't be that interesting. Well, by the time the book came out in 2005, of course, the radical right was a huge topic and continues to be. But I did spend some time focusing on EU immigration policy, which of course is directly relevant to what's going on with the radical right, because a lot of the parties and activists were really responding to immigration policy, and the EU's immigration policy was just developing in the late 1990s and early 2000s once they had the ability to legislate in those areas. But I also did work around immigrant integration policy, but then the Legislating Equality book actually grew out of my work on the radical right because the EU passed anti-discrimination policy in 2000 because of the rise of Jörg Haider's far-right Freedom Party in Austria. It was the Racial Equality Directive was a direct response to the rise of Jörg Haider. And so basically the 15 EU countries the 14 EU countries at the time passed this legislation to show that they were not racist, and that they felt that, Jörg Haider was racist, and so they had to have that response. also did work around immigration policy and security. And I do have to mention that I do have a new textbook out on immigration in the 21st century. Is a textbook on comparative immigration politics. And I hope you'll check it out because it just came out in May. But, I've been thinking a lot lately about the discourses around the radical right, and Larry mentioned some of these, but I really take a transatlantic perspective, and part of that is due to the work I'm doing right now for an upcoming book around the roots of racism, which focuses on history and the role of transatlantic white supremacy, which goes way, way back to the development of the slave trade into, of course, the 1800s around issues of immigration, especially, immigrants coming to the U.S., and how those different groups were racialized in different ways. But what's really has been interesting to me is putting things in the broader context, even from the, it's not just around, kind of the edges. It's a lot of this work and work around race and, fascism and so on. And, before fascism, some really became important in Italy and Germany. A lot of the ideas were out there. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, of course, we have the eugenics movement. We have various other movements that are really starting to play a role in the thinking around race, both in the US and across the Atlantic. So you have thinkers in Germany and the UK interacting with thinkers in the US. And so I've really been starting to think about that more and how it's still playing today, because of course we know a lot of the ideas and subjects that the far right today focuses on come from some of these philosophers and even political scientists going back to the late 1800s, or when political science was becoming a discipline. A lot of the focus was around race and the different groups around the world and how they were interacting and the potential for conflict. And of course, some of that still is part of what we discussed today. So coming back to the more recent time period, what I've been tracking and thinking about as well as the far right discourses from the 1990s have actually become mainstream by 2010. And my friend Cass Muda, talks about this, in his Twitter bio. He says, I used to study the far right, now I study the mainstream. So, and I've seen that, from my own work, that a lot of the things that people were saying in the 1990s have basically become mainstream. And we see that in the rise of Trump and a lot of the discourses in the GOP. But we went from, in Europe, we went from a focus on just during the time period that I was doing my research in the mid 1990s. My first research trip to Europe was in 1995, 25 years ago. There was more of a focus on nationality. By the time we hit 2000, the focus was on, Muslims. And we see the development of Islamophobia with folks like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and Pam Gellard here in the US. And then there's the veil and burqa issues and identity debates. And more recently, we go from, within the space of a year, from Brexit to Trump. And of course, as Larry's mentioned, we have this Black Lives Matter situation now, and the pandemic, which I think are interacting. And I think it's not just around this idea of policing and so on. It's obviously a broader set of issues that Black Lives Matter focuses on. But I think the pandemic is really having an impact in the sense that I think that was a trigger for people on the left to say, wow, we've seen the George Floyd, the Central Park incident, to really start to rethink the way they approach these issues and the ongoing marches for Black lives and so on. And so one of the things I'm wondering, though, is because we're seeing the response to the wearing of masks and the restrictions around COVID leading to the movement on the right, and then the Black Lives Matter and the right voting rights and all kinds of issues coming on the left, what kind of mix that's going to create. So I'm trying to think, going forward, are we going to see another backlash, or are we going to see a time where people are, there's at least one side of the issue where people are going to be more thoughtful and how these things like the pandemic are impacting different groups differently, versus the focus on masks and how the infringement, so-called infringement on liberties is impacting people. So, but one of the things I have noted, even for myself personally, is all of this has forced me to rethink, in the broader historical perspective, where does what's happening today fit in? And, you'll hear a lot of people talk about the 1920s, or and before, where immigration was a big issue, and where actually, a lot of the ideas, we would today look at them and say, wow, that's really extreme. The ideas people had about, people coming from different countries and different races. And, so when I think one of the problems I have had thinking about these ideas is that we tend to look at the right, I've always tried to focus on the broader context, but yet I haven't done enough in terms of the broader historical context. And that's why I'm really trying to think more broadly about the impact of white supremacy over the centuries, really, and how those ideas have developed over time, because it's clearly not new. African Americans in this country have certainly been dealing with these issues for hundreds of years. And then in Europe, it's certainly not new, because of course we know we had the Holocaust, we had, and it still have issues of race and racism in these countries. And so, I'm very encouraged by the fact that I see so many scholars, and even some this morning when I was watching part of the conference, who are really trying to look at this from a historical perspective. And, the linkage to voting for the AfD in Germany and the vote for the Nazi Party back in the 1930s, and looking at regional variations and how different regions have responded to these things. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. And I think, we need to do more of this work from a transatlantic perspective. And being a comparativist, I'm always pushing for the more of a broader perspective. But not only that, because it's not just transatlantic, obviously. We have to look at, what happens in places like New Zealand. You have the terror attack there. We've had terror attacks in Australia from the far right. And so I think it's important to think about the broader context of white supremacy and how it plays out in the political sphere, as well as, the kind of fringes, both on the left and on the right. And certainly on the left, kind of the response of Black Lives Matter and so on, but also on the right, the backlash and the concerns that are often raised by those types of issues. So, I think in general, in terms of the radical right, I have a lot of concerns because of the wielding of guns and so on. But I also think, there are some major concerns for what's going on in Europe, particularly around the political side of the equation, with the Brexit vote, with the rise of the AfD in Germany, with various other groups, and they're uncovering these groups within the German police that are very clearly drawing on Nazi propaganda and so on. So there's a lot of different issues we can discuss around that. But, I think if I were to go back to, my original work on the radical right, I think the whole political scene, particularly on the right, has shifted, and that, immigration and race has become an important focus for not just the radical right, but the center right, and appealing to a certain group of voters that is feeling, very concerned, very much that their culture is under attack, and that, they are losing out. And there are clear signs for many of them that they are losing out. But I also think it's important to maintain the context, the broader context, context. Sorry again. We were all having a little trouble with our voices today. But the broader context that there's what is kind of the response from both sides? So you've got the left responding in a particular way, and you've got the right responding in a particular way, and then you've got kind of the mainstream, middle of the road folks who are trying to, do this balancing act between, for political reasons, trying to maintain the center. And, it's a question of, to what extent are we going to see kind of pressure pushing people in two very different directions? So I'm going to actually leave it there because I think we should get into the discussion, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And we'll go, there's lots to talk about.
Great, thank you so much for your remarks. So we do have a few questions that have come into the Q&A already. And we encourage people to continue posting their questions into the Q&A or the chat. I am going to start with a question for Larry while people are still getting their questions in from the second presentation. This is related, we're gonna dive right in with a deep question, the descent into fascism. Kelly King remarks that she saw a presentation you gave about a month or so ago where you remarked that we haven't descended into fascism yet in the United States, that the criteria for that would be that Trump would need, one, an enabling law, and two, a private army. And then since that time, we have seen DHS sent to cities, and Professor Yu meeting with Trump to discuss how to use the recent Supreme Court ruling to expand presidential powers. So how much do you feel like we might have shifted since the last time you gave a talk on this subject in that direction?
Okay, I'm impressed by the accuracy with which my words have come back to me. But essentially what I said was that we are not in a period of fascism, and that there were these two criteria that would change that. And one was the enabling law, and as I may have pointed out back then, that's already happened in Hungary. And the other thing is militias, and it's a very good point. Is this Trump crossing the fascist Rubicon on that level by pulling out the militias who have appeared first in Washington and now in Minnesota and are threatened elsewhere? I think it's really important to look at where those militias are drawn from, and they're largely drawn from the Department of Homeland Security, and they have essentially been prepared for this by what's gone on the southern border. And what's gone on in the southern border is essentially a declaration of emergency there is a concept in political science called the state of exception. And the state of exception, which comes from Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi theorist, but has been re-examined by, among others, Giorgio Agamben. And what it essentially is about is stripping a category of people of all their rights. And that's what's happened on the southern border. And so the training of the people who are appearing without insignia on the streets of Minneapolis is treating people who are deprived of their rights. With respect to the coming of fascism, it is a significant step. I would not minimize it. What I would say on a more optimistic note is that the institutional structure in the USA has not crumbled. In general, the kinds of barriers that extreme right proto-fascist movements face around the world, those barriers are higher in the USA than elsewhere, which is not to, mythologize American democracy in any way, but to recognize that 250 years of institutional strength is very different than Hungary, which has been a democracy for 20, 25 years, 30 years. It's a very different situation. So that, yes, Trump maybe he hasn't crossed the Rubicon, but he's dipping his toes in the water, but he is getting pushed back in a way that fascist leaders like Mussolini and Hitler did not get, and people like Orban get in a much more diminished fashion.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rosenthal mentioned Hungary, and I think this segues into another question directed towards Dr. Gibbons about variations within Europe in terms of far-right politics, what those differences are, and some of the kind of reasons, kind of broad brush for why those differences exist and the areas of kind of particular concern.
Right. So back in the late 90s when I was doing this research, my focus was on electoral systems, which still plays, it's basically which is what Larry really is getting at. What kind of institutional structures are impacting the rise of these parties? And Germany, up until recently, has had fairly strong institutional barriers to the rise of the radical right. And it has to do with several things. It's not the voting system, the 5% hurdle, things like that. So I would say my hypothesis still holds going back to the late 1990s. This is part of the reason the AfD did so well, is because of I talk in my first book about it's not just the electoral threshold, is there a grand coalition in place which leaves space for a startup party, basically. And so, in both the case of Germany and Austria, you had the rise or some of the best electoral outcomes for the far right. In the case of Austria, the Freedom Party. In the case of Germany, the AfD, after you had a period of grand coalitions. So both you have both the left and right in government, and it makes it more difficult for them to separate themselves out for who's the opposition. And we also have a situation I don't think we haven't talked about very much yet, which is the decline of the left in Europe. The Socialist Party in France, the SPD in Germany. I mean, all these parties, and even in the UK, the Labour Party. I mean, we've seen a massive decline. I'm actually trying to dig more into that. I've just picked up a few books on kind of the decline of the left, but I did a commentary a few years ago about this, and that I think part of the reason for you can't talk about the rise of the right without talking about the decline of the left. And I think part of the reason for the decline of the left is that I go back to the late 1990s, early 2000s again when I was focused on this, but also just the fact that you had Bill Clinton, who is very much a neoliberal politician, very centrist, almost a little to the particularly compared to Europeans, to the right. Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and politicians in France who were very much centrists and pulled their parties far to the center. So we lost the strength of, unions were a huge, the decline of unions was a huge factor in the decline of the left, I believe. And also the fact that you see this shift towards, a decline of the welfare state, the loosening up of rules around welfare payments and so on. So I do think that there has been this shift on the left, which helps with understanding some of the variation in Europe. And some of those differences are, we're still seeing, across, but also the ability of the center right to absorb the far right parties is another factor that plays in. So if you have that's why you see a lot of the center right parties shifting to the right. I mentioned, the top discussions about I can't remember if I mentioned this, but it's something I usually remember to mention, which is the end of multiculturalism with Angela Merkel and David Cameron and I believe at the time it was Nicolas Sarkozy talking about the end of multiculturalism, or that multiculturalism had failed, and in around 2007, 2008. And so I think that's another added factor, is you have these right-leaning politicians also trying to take up some of that space, and some have been more successful at it than others.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Rosenthal, I'd like to dig deeper into the actions we've seen over the last few months, and teasing out some of the complications of the alliances and unexpected players that we've been seeing. I have in mind the Boogaloo Bois and the overtures within, as you've discussed, that sort of "don't tread on me" framework to trying to ally themselves with racial justice protesters, which I think also goes into some of what we've seen with groups like Patriot Prayer and its leader Joey Gibson, where we see a certain amount of racial and ethnic diversity rather than a form of strict white nationalism. And we see that as well in a lot of the groups that are predicated on these ideas around masculinity and male supremacism and their role as men or boys, as the Proud Boys and Boogaloo Bois put into their names. And then in addition to those, with the anti-lockdown protests as well, seeing the anti-vaxxer movement coming in as well in anticipation of a future vaccine, and the anti-vaxxer movement, having its conservative Christian dimensions, like in terms of people who oppose vaccinations for religious reasons. But most of the force of the anti-vaxxer movement is this secular conspiracist movement that believes misinformation about vaccines' connection to autism and other health issues, and actually often includes liberals in the suburbs who adhere to these concepts, and we've seen them coming out as well. And so can you dig more into what is going on and what we might expect to see in the upcoming year in terms of some of these alliances, and also what to kind of watch out for in terms of some of these frames that might sound appealing to social justice groups because of how they're framing something?
Well, that's a modest question. Let's see. The issue you raise around alliance of this far-right faction, the Boogaloo Bois, etc., with racial justice question. From their point of view, that's a relatively side matter. what they are moved by is this occasion on which there is an uprising, in their view, against constituted authority, and in particular against the police. They are, I think I used the phrase, essentialized revolutionaries. That is to say that what's important is the uprising. It's not the goal. So that what their if you want to call it alliance with things like Black Lives Matter is opportunistic, only begins to talk about the lack of depth of that connection. But as you say, there's an incredible number of, I think I referred when I was speaking before to suddenly with the George Floyd demonstrations, that this world that I've tried to sketch out kind of goes a little haywire. It gets very, very complicated. So you do get, for example, the anti-vaxxers, which, as you point out, is something that, plays very well in Marin County. It suggests an opening between a kind of alienated left and an alienated right, which in a funny kind of way, if you go back to people like Steve Bannon, Bannon's vision was a kind of hybrid populist movement of the left and the right, which is to say both cultural resentment and resentment against financial elites could come together. And he saw this in Europe. He saw this above all in, God, what were those guys called in Italy? The Five-Star Movement. The Five-Star Movement was Bannon's ideal. So in this moment in which, with the coming of the George Floyd protests, that, individual groups can cling on to some element and find themselves, as they say, with strange bedfellows. How that will sort out is not something I can predict. What I can say is that the bonds between these groups are limited. They're, I don't want to say temporary as much as, without deep roots.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Givens, the same question.
Yes. Well, I really want to comment on this idea of this kind of interesting overlap between the far left and the far right. And it, like you were saying, Larry, it's really interesting because there's this anti-police element on both sides, and as well as the anti-vaxxer movement just makes it a whole, very interesting thing. And I was thinking as we were having this discussion, to what extent you can even really call them left and right. I think it's hard to, and I was thinking exactly about the Five-Star movement, how do you, when it was, in the process of campaigning, and so how do you define that? And, I was kind of following that kind of closely because I was really interested in this idea of how do you define these movements that kind of are overlapping around particular issues. And even the immigration issues sometimes are very much hard to define whether it's left or right. And I know there's a couple questions about that coming, but I think that because of the weakness in Europe on the left in particular, and in the US, we have so much, well, we're losing the overlap between left and right. So we're almost, there's been more of an attenuation between left and right, and the rise of progressives who are winning elections at the local levels. I think that's the interesting difference between the US and Europe, is there's so much less, things are so much less centralized. There's lack of centralization, which is helpful in keeping fascism out, because you have so much more local control. So Portland could, eventually work out a deal with, the feds to kick out the border patrol guys. But it's also hurts us in the sense that we don't have a national plan for dealing with the COVID pandemic. So, I think there's, I'll leave it at, there's just some really, really interesting research that's going to come out of this time period, because there's so many interesting movements and waves and things that are happening that, for the US, it's been detrimental to have this lack of a national cohesion around dealing with the pandemic. And yet, on the other hand, it's kept us from having, a nationalized police that's, can be utilized like in countries like, or even the way the judiciary has been dealt with in Poland and Hungary. That's something that keeps us from, going further down that path, even though we're part of the way along the path to fascism and authoritarianism.
Thank you. So picking up on Portland and the federal agents there, Carol Mason asks Dr. Rosenthal to go back to the Turner Diaries and how you see the Day of the Rope in that book in relation to the infiltration of law enforcement, a la Kathleen Belew's Bring the War Home narrative of white nationalists in police and sheriff's office in relation to the federal agents in Portland. And if we can say that the Day of the Rope that Pierce envisioned has emerged in history through the decades of lethal police brutality.
Okay, Day of the Rope was one morning when I think I associated from the book with Los Angeles above all, and one morning 16 UCLA professors are discovered hanging from lampposts in LA, and this is a trope that lives fervently in the hearts of the kind of Civil War proponents that we're talking about. The real question about, or one of the questions about the Civil War, it's so strange to be talking like this, but is one of the assumptions of that mentality, the post-Turner Diary mentality, is that the police and the military will come over to their side. That's kind of taken for granted because they're like us. To whatever extent it appears, at play, that question in the USA, there's a real distinction between the condition of the police in this country and the condition of the military. The police seem far more of a piece with this mentality than the military services. It is certainly true that at the highest levels of the military service, the top brass are constitutionalists. They are not likely to turn on American demonstrators. In fact, to the extent to which General Mathis did so in Washington, clearing out Lafayette Park, he's recanted that. He's embarrassed by it. Trump has actually attempted, in my view, to make an alliance with, similar-minded, radical right members of the armed services below the level of the command level. Of course, he does have at the command level people like General Flynn and others, but below that, I think he's made a kind of how would you say, opening to people like, if you remember, Timothy McVeigh was in the U.S. Army and had fellows, like-minded people, and they still exist in the Army, and Trump has made an opening to them. For example, there was the case of Sergeant Gallagher. Sergeant Gallagher was court-martialed for offenses against civilians, and Trump not only spoke out against the court-martial, he brought pressure to bear after he was found guilty to minimize the sentence. So Trump is attempting to go beyond the level of the military establishment and make a connection, and that follows with his conflation of, let's see, I have this quote which is really well known, in which Trump says, "I can tell you I have the support of the police, the military, the support of the bikers for Trump. I have the tough people. They don't play it tough. They go to a certain point, and then it would be very, very bad, very bad." Trump not only is addressing the like-minded enlisted people in the Army, he's also conflating them with bikers and the like, with gang violence. And that is, an attempt to form a kind of amalgam of people who would, join the kind of resistance that is being suggested by, or being suggested by Trump's framing of things as we are threatened by terrorism of the left, of Antifa. He's attempting to amalgamate whomever would do that. And, questions of people in the police and in the military are central to that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gibbons, I want to shift tracks a little bit because I'd like to hear a bit more from your expertise as you're positioned now working on higher education. And we are going into this period of an upcoming school year where we're expecting to have a lot of campuses being virtual, and they're figuring out other kind of directions after sort of a hasty changeover in the middle of spring semester. You've written in the past about Trump catering to the right with one of his executive orders about free speech on campus. Betsy DeVos recently released the new Title IX rule impacting college campuses coming up. So it's clear that they're potentially interested in continuing to influence college campuses and university campuses, even with what's going on. And while those campuses are often sites of in-person protests and controversies, now with campuses being online, There have been incidents with Zoom bombing of classes, often by racist or misogynist actors. There's concerns for professors about being recorded and taken out of context by right-wing groups. So what should we be aware of and concerned about in terms of the higher education sphere going into this upcoming school year?
Yeah, and I highly recommend that you check out PEN American's website. They've been doing a lot around this topic. And that's actually, I did a webinar with one of their, the person in their office who works on higher ed issues, because obviously free speech has been a huge issue in higher ed, as we've seen, college campuses, being the site of kind of these conflicts between these speakers like Richard Spencer and the left-leaning groups, and including in Berkeley, Antifa and so on, that have come out in against having these very far-right speakers on campuses. And so one thing we know is that these speakers aren't going to be coming on these campuses in the fall unless it's in very small venues or via Zoom. And for campus leaders, this is a challenge because the whole free speech issue, and how that plays out as you go online is going to be, interesting. I follow a lot of faculty forums, and faculty are trying to figure these things out. And so, I do think it's an important time for faculty to be, and campus leaders to be very aware on a daily basis, pretty much what's going on with their online courses, with, how, there've been, the latest I saw is that there's been encouragement for students to, if things are recorded and so on, to share, not just with some of these far right people, but just to share their courses, period, so people can take them without paying and things like that. So, so this whole move online is generating its own set of issues for campuses that are trying to navigate this. I mean, obviously the first priority is just getting online and making sure faculty can manage things like Zoom, like we're doing now. But then there's the whole issues of privacy. How do you manage that? How do you make sure that you're not being Zoom bombed and so on? And there's lots of good practices around that, obviously. I'm sure we would have been Zoom bombed today if people had the opportunity, but because you can use the different tools, Zoom has had to scramble to develop all these tools, obviously. I think there's just so much that's, there's a lot of uncertainty around all of this. And, PEN American has actually some guidelines around free speech and how to deal with some of these issues on campuses. So like I said, please, go to PEN American's website and check those out. We've talked about it in my own newsletter, the Higher Ed Connects. And because we're in such an uncertain situation, I mean, there's still some, the number keeps dropping every day, the percentage of campuses that are planning to go face-to-face versus virtual. And we're dealing with this in my own household because my son is still planning to go to his campus, but we're not sure what that's going to look like. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I highly suggest that those who are really interested in this topic, there's a lot going on out there around this. And like I said, PEN American is a great, they have a big free speech project going on. And also you can follow us at our newsletter, because we'll be discussing these issues going forward, but there's a lot of discussion going on around this. And I don't have any definitive answers to those questions because there's still so much uncertainty, as we know, going into the fall. But the broader point is, for those who are doing research in this area, is we really have to be following closely what happens from campus to campus. And this fall is going to be very uncertain in terms of how students are going to react to the election, to the Black Lives Matter movement. Students still are just starting to go to their campuses or to be interacting virtually. And so there's going to be a lot going on this fall.
So we're getting towards our last 10 minutes, and I would like to give our speakers a chance to direct a question to each other, something that they were interested in the other presenters' talk that they would like to follow up on.
Sure. And I'll let Larry jump in.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by, I guess, I mean, I don't like to be put on the spot of what do you think will happen,
I don't
but
either.
you know, it is tempting, and so I'm curious about how you perceive things in Europe. What one of the very interesting things that's happening is the European Union. One could say this is, neoliberalism
Mhm.
attempting to rise up to the occasion and assert itself by kind of centralizing the financial dimensions of the COVID crisis, so that it's European-wide, which is completely in contrast to what they did in 2008 and 2007 with the financial crisis. So I'm really struck by, in a funny way, all elements are foreseeing what they want to do, given the COVID crisis. And, so for example, China decides it's time to take over Hong Kong.
Right. Mhm.
There's all sorts of things of that nature going on. Do you perceive the European Union seeing this as an occasion to centralize in a way that, in the direction of United States of Europe, that will make the, neoliberalist and perhaps a little less unequal neoliberalism survive this crisis, standing on its feet?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I've been, I was watching what happened with the most recent, the response to, the COVID crisis and the financial situation. And, there's always been this divide. Well, there's various divides in the EU, right? And of course, I think they're happy that the UK is gone because they don't have to worry about that divide. But you've got the countries in the South that, had to be bailed out, not just the South, because we can't forget Ireland, but there were these bailouts that happened in 2007, 2008, and 2009, really, and continued to a certain extent into the next few years, and the resentment that created. So I think that was playing out to a certain extent in the most recent negotiations, over the what they were going to put into bailouts again. And there's this sense that the North is, they're the people who save and all that, and the people in the South are spendthrifts. These very, very interesting tropes. But I think that the EU is going to struggle, and that actually this current situation is going to make things harder for the EU to centralize. And I think, but that's been a constant for the last 15 years or so, is that the EU actually has been going. We had this strong consolidation in the 80s going into the 90s going into the early 2000s. So you had all these different treaties that came into play that pulled the EU together. And so I think actually we're going to see a lot of splits, and they're going to be on different fracture lines. And so you hear different versions of, we had initially it was two-speed Europe, now it's multi-speed Europe, where some countries are coming together and others are pulling away. And so you've got that happening in Hungary, Poland to a certain extent, other Eastern European countries that are very fragile right now, and even Southern European countries. So I would hesitate to say that neoliberalism is really going to play out the way we expect it to, or might have expected prior to the current crisis, in that, but I do think the EU is just they're going to continue to struggle around all these different axes that are pulling them in different directions. And, there's going to be a variety of issues that will be similar to what's happening here in the US that are pulling different parts of the EU apart versus coming together. So, and I guess my question to you is then to turn the tables is, yeah, I'd love to hear more, this, the visualization, since I went to UCLA for grad school, the visualization of, my professors in the hanging from the lampposts is, not the greatest, but I do think, with what I haven't seen, which I thought we would see more of by now, is more of a consolidation on the right. And I'm curious, I mean, you've mentioned some issues around this here in the US specifically, and you mentioned that you could talk about it. So I would love to hear just a little bit more about why we haven't seen more of a consolidation on the right around the militias and some of these groups that seem to be almost fighting each other instead of coming together.
Well, okay. As I suggested earlier, that there's a considerable fluidity among these groups. So that, someone who has been an alt-righter, can wake up one day and say, hell with that, and I'm going to be a Boogaloo Boy today. So you do get a lot of that. But the different visions are really considerable. Like American political parties or European political parties who, don't like their losers, who remembers Michael Dukakis, the failure of the alt-right coming out of Charlottesville was really significant, and we can go into the nature of that failure, but it did, demythologize. It did debunk the Spencer vision. The only, in a way, the place that it endures most successfully is in the current Donald Trump electoral campaign, which is to say, alt-right, alt-left, Antifa is going to get your mother, that kind of thing. Within the right, it has met a considerable, it's disenchanted. It's lost its shine. And what you get instead, there's a meme which I find quite extraordinary because that's current on the Boogaloo right, which is vote from the rooftops. And vote from the rooftops is taken from the image of Korean American shop owners during the Rodney King riots, who would shoot from the rooftops in the hands of this Boogaloo right. That's understood as vote, that as a replacement for voting. This is the only real voting that's going to take place. That's very different than the Spencer model. The Spencer model based on the Nazis and the Italian fascists, both of whom came to power via electoral means, not electoral means sitting on top of a shop, on Melrose Boulevard. I mean, it's a different thing altogether. So, there has been this, drift in the larger world of far-right pro-militia types toward the this Boogaloo version and away from the alt-right. And you know, it's not clear that this particular vision will have a greater longevity than what the Spencer vision got to have. But like the Spencer vision, it will have echoes inside the Trump government and inside the Republican Party.
I just want to add one last thing is we're going to have to, it's going to be very interesting to see how the New York Attorney General's, taking on the NRA is going to impact all of this.
Imagine that.
Yes.
taking on the NRA.
Yeah, can you just, even though we're at time, quickly for anyone who didn't see the news this morning, just explain what was going on with the NRA that you just mentioned, the Attorney General's action?
Sure. There's been a long-standing investigation into the NRA about how they've been spending their funds and so on, basically to enrich the leaders, millions of dollars, 63 million I saw in the article today. So the New York Attorney General is suing the NRA and asking for them to be disbanded. So that's the news today.
Yeah, and in a funny way, the model for that is the Trump Foundation,
mm-hmm. Yep.
which suffered at the same hands and suffered that kind of disbanding, and were forced actually finally to give away some of their money rather than give it to Ivanka.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much to both of our panelists for being with us today and for your really insightful comments. I am putting into the chat the link to the breakout room where we'll be having our closing networking reception. That link was also sent out through Eventbrite, but in case you didn't have it, you can register there to get the Zoom information to join, and it gives us a chance to get together in small breakout groups and for attendees to be able to talk with one another like we would love to do if we were together in person. So thank you to everybody who helped with putting this conference together. Thank you to all of our attendees. For those of us who have joined us from Australia and similar time zones, we'll be doing our regular replay of the morning sessions at 5 p.m. And we hope to see you at the networking event coming up at 2 p.m. Pacific time. So thank you again, Dr. Rosenthal and Dr. Givens. Thank you to all reporters, and we hope to have a chance to chat a little bit more soon.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.